Welcome to this Policy Options webinar on constituency-level election campaign. We would like to begin by acknowledging that Policy Options is broadcasting to you from the unceded indigenous land of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation. Tiohtià:ke, or Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. And I'll leave you with the moderator of today's event, member of the Board of Directors of the IRPP, Alex Marland.
So first off, we're going to end up speaking with Erin Crandall. Erin wrote about local fundraising with MP Cody Blois, who's an MP in Nova Scotia, and Erin is an associate professor at Acadia. Hi, Erin.
Hi, everyone.
Okay, and then after that, we're going to go to Royce Koop, and Royce is a professor at the University of Manitoba. And Royce has written extensively about constituency-level campaigning. He's written a book called Grassroots Liberals, and he's written a chapter for this forthcoming book dealing with sort of the sum of all his knowledge, along with another professor, Anthony Sayers. Hey, Royce.
Hi, everyone.
And last but not least, we're going to then turn to Minister Sarah Stoodley. And Sarah is the Minister of Digital Government in the government of Newfoundland and Labrador. And she wrote what I believe to be a very important piece for Policy Options about her experience seeking re-election in the pandemic election earlier this year in Newfoundland and Labrador. So it was during very, very extreme circumstances, and she documented what she was going through. And on top of that, why I believe her piece is so significant is because she also talks about what it's like to campaign as a mother of a newborn infant, which presents additional challenges that some of us don't always think about. So I'm very grateful that she wrote for Policy Options that way. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, everyone.
Okay, so we're going to start things off now. We're going to turn the floor over to Erin. Erin's going to talk for approximately 7 minutes. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Alex, for that introduction. And hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be able to join you today and to talk about local party fundraising. So just a little way of background about myself. I have done a fair amount of research on third-party advertising regulations federally, and kind of taking a national look and looking at the constitutionality of some of those regulations. But this study was different for me because it was very, very local. The study focused in on the riding where I live and work, Kings Hands, which is located in Mi'kmaq, the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq Nation, and it's in a rural part of Western Nova Scotia that includes the Annapolis Valley. It's very much an agricultural kind of center, the breadbasket of Nova Scotia. And I got to collaborate, as Alex was saying, with the local Liberal MP Cody Blois, who was first elected in 2019 and was seeking re-election this fall. And I'll say that looking at Kings Hands, and the Liberal Party in particular in Kings Hands, is interesting for a few reasons. The Liberal Party candidate has held Kings Hands since 2003, but by no means should it be considered a Liberal stronghold. From 2003 to 2019, Kings Hands was represented by a longtime Liberal MP and former Trudeau cabinet minister, Scott Bryson. And for those who know a little bit about Scott Bryson, he's an incredibly well-known and popular person in this riding. And notably, prior to 2003, Bryson held this riding as a member of the Progressive Conservative Party, and then he crossed the floor to the Liberals. And since Bryson's switch, the Conservatives have always placed second. And prior to Bryson's switch, this was traditionally a Conservative riding. And so when Bryson decided to retire, there was a real question of whether or not this had become a Liberal-friendly riding, or if it was a riding where Scott Bryson just happened to be an incredibly popular member of Parliament. So there was a lot of things going on in this riding over the election. Another factor was the fact that we had a provincial election over the summer in Nova Scotia, and we had a surprise majority win with the Progressive Conservative Party coming into government. And really the strength of the Progressive Conservative Party was in the rural parts of Nova Scotia, like the Annapolis Valley, where Kings Hands is located. And more generally, recent research has shown us that federal Liberal strength in rural ridings has decreased significantly over the past few decades. So at King's Hands, the fact that it's been held by a Liberal candidate, a Liberal MP for so long is actually quite interesting, and it might tell us something about what's going on and what's important at the local level when we're talking about campaigning and fundraising. So for Cody Blois, he won the riding in 2019. Again, he won and ran in 2021. But importantly, he was running a candidate and local issues focused campaign. And this kind of candidate focused campaign also played an important role in the way the local party fundraised. So for Blois, this meant that he was his own fundraising lead. For the most part, he was the one making the phone calls to potential local donors and asking for their support. He was also the one following up the phone calls with personalized emails that would provide links to how to make online donations to the local party association. And in general, his pitch to potential donors focused on local issues, especially agriculture. And he had made a point of making agriculture a large part of the work that he did, both in the riding in Ottawa. He served on the agricultural committee. He was the caucus chair of the Liberals Rural Caucus. And this tied into an important economic component of the riding of King's Hands. This fundraising approach did not rely heavily on Liberal Party branding. And in fact, in Blois' experience, it's not unusual to receive a larger donation from a supporter who says, you know, I don't consider myself a Liberal. I'm supporting you in this local campaign because you're prioritizing issues that matter to me. And so because of this candidate-focused approach to fundraising, Blois needed to use his limited personal resources strategically. And I think this is not uncommon in terms of local campaign fundraising in comparison to the national campaign, which can scale up small donations by relying, on professional fundraisers, on automated technologies. Blois focused on potential donors who were likely to make larger donations of $500 or more. And so if you compare the average donation at the local party level versus the national level, there are significant differences. And so it's much more common to see large donations at the local level. And strategically, if you can get 15 to 20 donors who are able to donate $500 or more, then you're well on your way to being able to fund your local election campaign. And I'll also note just very briefly that this focus on local issues in terms of pitching for fundraising also extended to the local campaigning in general, that there were a lot of local issues that came up during the campaign in King's Hands, and that for Blois, this meant kind of striking a fine balance between being the Liberal candidate and following the Liberal platform, but also at times having to distance himself from some of the decisions that the Liberals had made when they were in government. And we can talk more about that during our Q&A if you'd like. And so in terms of the performance of Blois and the riding, he did win his riding, as I mentioned, and this was in a province where the Liberals dropped 2 of their seats and their overall vote count went down in terms of Liberal support, whereas it went up in King's Hands, which would suggest that this local approach did pay off in the riding of King's Hands. And so I'll just leave it there.
All right, thank you very much, Erin. That was great. Now we're going to turn it over to Royce. I'm just going to talk for about 7 minutes or so.
All right, thanks, Alex, and thanks for being here. So to all of you, as Alex said, for this particular chapter in this book that we've been working on, Anthony Sayers and I went and interviewed some campaign managers specifically about that role, but both of us have been watching these local campaigns. We've been observing them for some time. And so for this short talk, I wanted to, it's maybe a little less structured than Erin's talk. I wanted to point to 3 interesting things and stories that people that have not been involved in local or constituency campaigns might find interesting, and also that I think illustrates some of the diversity in these constituency campaigns. So the first relates to campaign managers, which is what we wrote about for this volume. Most people think campaign managers, what they do is they run the campaign. They do that, but there's another aspect of the job, which is to manage the candidate. And I don't think a lot of people realize that this is the case. Candidates who are actually competitive in these races, they put their best face forward, they're prepped for events, they know the issues, they have the answers when you talk to them on the doorstep. But a lot of times this is because campaign managers have been successful in preparing them, getting them ready for the kind of encounters that they have in the constituency. So campaign managers give candidates advice on what events to attend and how to approach those events, how to approach people there. They coach them on their performance in debates and in any kind of interaction with voters. They provide constructive criticism. They push candidates out of the campaign office, and this is the most common refrain here from candidates. What's the biggest part of the job? Well, candidates love to hang out in the campaign office. They like to drink coffee and visit with volunteers. But as a lot of these campaign managers say, oh, there's no votes to be found in the campaign office. They're already going to vote for you. So they got to push the candidates out the door, get them onto the doorsteps, and talking to and identifying supporters out in the riding. So the relationship between the campaign manager and the candidate, it really is the kind of central relationship in these constituency campaigns. And when that relationship is good, when the candidate and the campaign manager trust each other, they can rely on each other, the campaign prospers. When that relationship fails, a lot of times the campaign can fail as a result. The second point relates to all candidates forums in the constituencies. In each Canadian election in recent history, we hear stories about candidates who are skipping all candidates forums and how this is terrible. It's an affront to local democracy. And I think what a lot of people don't know is that candidates often like going to these events and they want to go, but they're discouraged from going by the national campaign, by the national party. The thinking being that anyone who's going to be at an all candidates forum, they probably already made up their mind. And so there's no point in going to a forum when candidates could instead be out knocking on doors, canvassing, and identifying supporters. So there's also a sense that there's a potential for candidates to misspeak. If you go to an all candidates forum, there's more potential. You can say problematic things and it turns into a national story that the national campaign has to deal with. So if your local candidate is not attending all candidates forums, you don't necessarily have to blame the candidate. You can sometimes blame the central party. They're the ones putting pressure on the candidate. And finally, as a more general point here, local campaigns are not as much about persuasion as you might think. Politics is about persuasion. Local campaigns aren't. They're not about persuasion. They're much more about identifying supporters and using that information to get out the vote. And we see this in the canvass. The most important thing that local campaigns do is the canvass, going out and identifying supporters, knocking on doors. So if you've never canvassed with a candidate, you might be surprised to see how it's done in a professional campaign. Candidates and their volunteers, they move quickly through whole neighborhoods. They swoop down the street, teams of 5 or 6 or 7 people. They quickly move through whole neighborhoods using new technology on their phones to identify supporters and non-supporters and clarify contact information, collect that data, make sure that the address and the telephone number are correct so that those people can be called on election day, see if they need a ride to the polls. So candidates are discouraged from getting into arguments. Candidates should not be arguing with people in local campaigns. And the national campaign encourages everyone to move quickly from house to house. If there's an opposing party sign, the advice is you skip the house. You already know what party the person's going to vote for. There's no point in going there and getting into an argument with someone who's not going to support you. So this is the guidance that local campaigns and candidates get. But of course, it doesn't always happen. We do get candidates who ignore what the national campaign wants. They knock on all doors, they get into arguments, they see their role as being persuasive. And I've seen candidates, including a candidate who won, you get into lengthy arguments and policy discussions with constituents you can spend half an hour on someone's doorstep and ultimately not even convince one person to vote for you. And so the canvas, the most important thing that these constituency campaigns do, if they're being done in a professional way, they're done in a way that that I think a lot of people would not expect. Focusing on identifying supporters rather than persuasion, moving very, very quickly, as opposed to getting into arguments and discussions with their constituents. With voters. And maybe I'll leave it there.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Royce. Next up, we have Sarah Stoodley.
Thank you very much, Alex. It was great, Royce. I might touch on some of what you said there for a minute. So afterwards, so I'm Sarah. I'm MHA from Mount Sion, which is essentially St. John's North and a part of the town of Paradise, which is next to St. John's. And so I've done 2 elections now. I've been successful 2 elections in 2.5 years. The most recent, as Alex mentioned, was our pandemic election last January, which ran from January, February into March. So it was quite a long and interesting ride, which I'll chat about. So I did have a master's in political science before my past job, which was in insurance, working for a national insurance company managing their digital storefronts, I guess, across Canada. So I then jumped in the political scene, and it's been a wild ride. And now I'm Minister of Digital Government and Service and a few other things here in Newfoundland and Labrador. And so I thought I'd touch on some of what Alex mentioned in terms of the pandemic and campaigning in a pandemic election, although happy to answer any questions in the Q&A as well. And so I think the first thing I thought I'd mention, well, just some background. So we did have an election during a pandemic, and the COVID cases in Newfoundland and Labrador kept rising. And there is a policy options article that I wrote about this on the website. And so as the lockdown kept getting, I guess, greater and greater, and the restrictions kept being added, so much so that on the eve of the election, it was decided that there was not going to be an in-person voting, that all remaining votes would have to be cast by special ballot, which you could apply online or vote by mail, which could change completely the dynamic of the election. So I guess there's 3 ways that I found personally that impacted me and my campaign. The first one, the most important, I think, was around data. So obviously, as you heard Erin and Royce talk about, collecting data is an extremely important part of a campaign, and going door to door. But what happens if you can't go door to door? So during our pandemic election, at some point during the campaign, it's all a bit of a blur now, but it was decided, it was no longer safe to go door to door for, our protection and the protection of all the voters and residents. And so at that point, we stopped going door to door. It was certainly around the midway point, if I remember correctly. And up to that point, we were doing our door to door canvassing with our volunteers as per normal. Obviously, some accommodations being made for COVID-19. There are no gatherings in person. It was kind of pointless to have a headquarters because you couldn't gather there. And we were limited to how many people were in a vehicle, and masks all the time, and sanitizer and extra expenses. But essentially then once that lockdown happened and we couldn't go door to door, we were left then with the people we had identified. We just lost 2 weeks of identifying voters. So then it was about how do we I guess make sure we get at the vote, make sure we get as many of these identified voters out as possible. So that was a really interesting and challenging experience. And then during the pandemic, as the election date kept getting pushed out, as our chief electoral officer struggled to capture everyone who wanted to vote by mail, capture their ballots. And I guess Alex also mentioned that I had a new baby at the time. He was 4 to 6 months during the election. So towards the end of the election, it was quite nice. I just got to stay home with my new baby. So that was lovely. But I guess some of the other things I thought might be interesting, in addition to the data, now looking back as an elected member, for my first election, I can see a breakdown poll by poll of where I was successful and where I wasn't within my district. But as a result of the most recent election, where the actual election day was canceled and there was the advance polls and then everyone else voted by special ballot, logistically, the way the special ballots were organized, it means there was no post-election data. So for the most recent election in Newfoundland and Labrador, we don't, as the whole province, we don't have any information in terms of what polls I'm doing well, or you know, did I pick up votes, where did I lose votes? And then I guess the third element I thought might be interesting is some of the costs for our election campaign. So we incurred extra costs around PPE. You know, during the lockdown, all of our costs kind of just stood still. So I had furniture rented that all had to stay in its place for over a month while we weren't allowed in the building because, you know, people couldn't access public buildings. Our sign team had to spend an extra, I think, a month managing, fixing signs during a winter election. So that was an interesting challenge that my sign team had, a lot of extra costs fixing signs. And then obviously, as the rules changed and the information changed, we also had to get additional materials printed to get out to the people we had identified who hadn't yet voted. So one day we were saying, vote tomorrow at this place. The next week, we were giving them a piece of mail saying, now this is the only way you can vote now. You have to go to this website or call me or call Elections NL, and you had to get a special ballot application to mail in. So certainly an interesting experience. And then I guess, okay, in the few minutes I have left, I just touch on, so I did have a 4 to 6 month old during our most recent election. That was a bit challenging, obviously. The first time I wasn't able to put him to bed was difficult. And then I guess I'll also throw in one interesting thing I found was the nuances of trying to breastfeed while going door to door. And so obviously, you know, you want to hit as many doors as possible. It's like a race, you know, you have to be efficient as possible, as some of the speakers have mentioned. And so you don't really try and drink a lot because you don't want to stop, you know, going door to door. But then while you're breastfeeding, you have to stay hydrated. So that was a particularly interesting challenge. And then I really had to stop going door to door to pump. And I pumped in the back of my car and I pumped in the back of other candidates' cars. So that was certainly an interesting experience. My door-to-door schedule is built around our pumping schedule. Anyway, so I'll close it there, but happy to answer any questions in the Q&A. Thanks, everyone.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Okay, so thank you everybody for that. What we're going to do now is we're going to open it up to some of the questions that are there, and I'm going to moderate some of these questions, so I'm going to just pick some out and then present them. And for the most part, I'll let Royce and Sarah and Erin decide how they want to answer. I think it's best maybe if just one of you answers so that we can get through as many questions as possible. And also it's nice to hear from everybody as opposed to necessarily just one of you. So the first question that I'll just pitch is from Jenny Armstrong at Carleton University. And she says, sometimes parties will run paper candidates. So these are people who have little or no connection to the riding. Do any of you know if there's any stats on this? And what's the rationale for running a full slate when some of the ridings are clearly unwinnable? So are there any stats about paper candidates, and what's the rationale for running a full slate? Do any of you have any comments on that, any of the panelists?
Could I answer this one?
Yeah, of course.
So it's a great question. I mean, there's data on all of the candidates. The question of which are actually what we might call paper candidates that aren't actually competitive. What Anthony Sayers, my co-author, would call stopgap candidates. It's a question of how many people campaign, how many people actually have money. But the question of why parties do this, that's a great question. Part of the reason they do it is because 20, 30 years ago, parties in Canada criticized each other, say, well, you're not really a national party. When we had regional parties like the Reform Party, the Alliance, we still have the Bloc, Liberal Party, the PC Party, say, well, you're not a real party. You're not a national Canadian party. And so we get this phenomenon of Canadian parties running candidates in seats where they don't have a hope of winning. And from a normative perspective, I've written briefly about this, it would be far better for parties just not to run candidates in seats where they don't have a hope, to be honest about this. Because a lot of times when parties have problems during election campaigns, candidates get into trouble. This is related to candidates in paper campaigns. And so that's why they do it. It would be far better if parties just gave up to this fiction and didn't run candidates in seats where they didn't have any hope.
Okay, thanks, Royce. So next question I'm going to ask either Erin or Sarah to answer. And this question is from Joe Murray. What difference if any, are there between how the Liberal Party campaigns locally versus other parties such as the Tories or the New Democrats? So do you have any observations about that?
I could take a shot at answering that, and I'll just speak about my insights more so in Nova Scotia than other parts of the country, because I do think it really depends on the dynamics and strength of the party in a particular part of the country. And in Nova Scotia, both the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party are quite strong, especially the Liberal Party. But I think what I learned from Cody Blois, especially when we're talking about these rural ridings, and I think there are unique dynamics to rural ridings as opposed to urban ridings, is that they're trying to balance the party brand with the local issues. And that is one of the challenges that goes along with the local party campaign, is that even if empirically, we find that maybe the local candidate is explaining 4 to 10% of the vote in the riding. If you would ask, I think, a Liberal candidate, Conservative candidate in Nova Scotia, how much the local candidate and the issues matter, I think they would put it on the higher end. And so I think that's one of the balancing things that is happening, at least in this part of the country, for those parties.
All right. Thanks, Erin. So Sarah, I'm going to present you with the next question. It's from an anonymous participant, but I'm just going to adjust it a little bit so that it reflects your experience. So think about yourself as a candidate, and you had a campaign manager, I presume, and the campaign manager is probably trying to get you to do certain things. But of course, as a candidate, you've got your own mind on certain things and may not agree always with the campaign manager. So maybe just talk to us about that dynamic, about the push and pull between what the campaign manager or even what the higher ups might want you to do versus as a candidate, you have a gut instinct that you should be doing something different.
Sure, sounds good. And so in my 2 elections, I found that experience very different. As a new candidate, my first time running, I was kind of really on my own, and I had a lot of advice. People were advising me to do something a certain way, but it was really up to me. And I guess I had no history with the party, honestly. I showed up one day with my nomination papers, and so I didn't, they didn't know much about me. And so I guess during my first election, I was really kind of selling myself. And I guess, as Erin would say, I do think I brought more than 10 to 14%, I think, to the results, but who knows? I'm sure, as Erin mentioned, most candidates would say that. The second election I was running as a minister, so that's obviously very different. And so then I understand the kind of rules. I understand what's appropriate and not appropriate. And I have a better understanding of politics in Newfoundland and Labrador, so that was very important. I guess in terms of my campaign manager and other senior people around, they certainly were there to provide advice, and ultimately I think it was still up to me. I think there's only 2 or 3 instances where I was advised strongly to do something, and I still had the option, but it all worked out. So there definitely is that push and pull, but ultimately as a candidate, I think you are ultimately responsible for getting elected or not. And you have to knock on those doors and look those people in the eye when you represent them and help them solve their problems. And I know, like, next time I knock on their door, if I don't meet what I told them, then they're going to call me out on that, as they should. So I just think it was very different the first time running as an unelected versus then as a minister running the second time. Was very different experiences in that regard. Thank you.
Right. So I guess in some ways the answer is depending on how much experience you might have, you might feel more comfortable pushing it back. Right. Okay, the next question is for any one of you, and it's from David McLaren. Just wondering, what are some of the best practices for local electoral district associations? But specifically, what can an electoral district association or an EDA, what can it do when it's in a riding that is, a strong, safe seat of another party? So you're in opposition and you're not getting many votes. What can local EDAs do in those types of circumstances to try to break through?
I mean, I could give some advice on that. So my district association, they're my people. They're not they're not Liberal people from my party. They're my friends, and so I guess knowing and speaking with my colleagues and stuff as well, and what we're looking at. I would say if you have a district association in a riding where they don't have a candidate or an elected member, I would say their top priority would be to fundraise and select a good, or work on getting a good candidate who could potentially beat the opposition candidate, or the candidate who's currently elected. And so I would say those are the primary two things I would do if I were them.
Okay. And Hugh Siegel has made a comment just pointing out that, part of the difference to keep in mind generally is that Conservatives and Liberals seem to handle data mining slightly differently. And so a lot of the time, the Conservatives at this, collecting data, and some of the platforms that they have may be up to individual Conservatives to figure out, or in different provinces, they may use different platforms compared to, that isn't necessarily aligned with what the federal Conservatives are using. Whereas, of course, the Liberal Party being far more integrated, liberalist is very common, and then with NDP and Populist and others. So some of these things factor into what it is that is happening at a local EDA level in between elections. To what extent are you using the national platform? Sarah, there's a question for you from a participant, an anonymous participant, wondering if you have any insights that you can share about recommendations for increasing diverse women candidates. So think about your experience and how can different women get involved in politics or potentially run and get elected?
Sure, absolutely. I thought a little bit about this, and just what comes to mind, I guess the first one would be childcare. And I did look at whether or not I could expense some of my childcare costs in terms of our election expenses. And I believe you could if they fell outside of the 9 to 5 range. And if obviously you'd need receipts and stuff. And so it's challenging though, because daycare centers don't operate outside of 9 to 5 or on weekends. And I had a 4-month-old, obviously, and so I can't put a 4-month-old in daycare. So that wasn't an option for me, claiming those expenses as part of my election expenses. So, and actually in our province, we've looked at that in terms of potential changes for our legislation. So childcare, the other potentially costs, I had a few thoughts now, I'm losing them. I'll have to come back, sorry. Childcare would be the biggest one, making accommodations for childcare expenses.
Right. One of the things I liked about what you wrote in Policy Options, Sarah, was how you were saying in between campaigning, you were having to nurse your child in the car. And it just really helped me realize this is a challenge that a lot of us don't always necessarily think about when people are putting their names forward to be a contestant. Something that is interesting that an anonymous participant has asked is a question that is frankly not something I've given much thought to until just now. How does local campaigning change when we know now that increasing numbers of citizens have cameras installed on their doorbells or just above their doors, and whatever they're documenting could possibly end up online? I mean, this really takes away from if you happen to be, I don't know, maybe a Calgary contestant who ends up taking something out of a mailbox and getting caught doing that. I mean, these are different things than used to happen in the past. So do any of you have any thoughts about whether or not this changes dynamics?
I can just mention from my experience, I guess, I was warned, and, we have to be very careful, obviously, what you say at the door if there's a video doorbell. My first election, I rang a doorbell. It was election day, and they answered on their phone, and they said, I'm in line to vote for you. And I was standing in their doorway. So that was a fun experience. And then, when I go out with other candidates, new candidates, for example, I always make sure, there's a video doorbell, everything you say now is they could be listening to us right now. So you have to be just super careful.
Okay, great. The following question, I'll suggest that Erin or Royce, maybe you could take it, from Celia Grimard. And what do you think about the idea of maybe Elections Canada being involved in holding public questions and answer sessions, and so them being the ones who coordinate local level debates? So at the national level, of course, we now have debates that are nationally organized, but at the local level, it's just kind of left to different organizations to set these things up. What if Elections Canada did this at the local level and encouraged candidates to participate in a local debate?
I can answer that if you want, Erin. It's not a bad idea. I mean, there are usually all candidates forums. I mean, you don't necessarily want to get the government involved unless there's a problem that you're trying to solve. But most of the time, there's some community group or the Chamber of Commerce that's willing to organize these debates. I think a bigger issue is if candidates don't go. If you're concerned about that, that's the kind of issue that I might be thinking about. But yeah, I don't hear many complaints about kind of debates that aren't being organized well. And so, yeah, I think it's a good idea. I'm just not sure it would solve any problems.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to come back to you, Royce, now, but then Erin, I'm going to pitch a question to you that's got to do with youth. So Royce, there's an MLA from Saskatchewan, Lisa Lambert, and she is mentioning about how you had said maybe it'd be better off not to run paper candidates for a party. But maybe you might want to consider the fact that this is a bit of a balance between what the local constituency association is doing and what the central party wants to encourage. I mean, the central party is the one that might have no incentive to have a paper candidate, but sometimes the local association can feel that it's absolutely like that's their job. Their job is to make sure there is a candidate in place. So what would you say to electoral district associations that, hey, you don't bother running a paper candidate, what you're doing doesn't really matter?
Yeah. I mean, if there are people in the EDA, if there's this kind of vibrant local party organization, then usually we get a candidate, usually even if they don't win, they're getting a respectable vote share. When I'm talking about paper candidates, I'm talking about candidates in places where there really isn't much, the party doesn't have much presence. There won't be many activists in the local organization. There might not even be a local board. There might be kind of that's the idea of a paper party, kind of a presence on paper. And in these ridings, sometimes the party convinces someone, a lot of times from outside of the riding, hey, just put your name forward. It would really help us out. Maybe there'll be something waiting for you down the line if you can help us out on this occasion. That I'm aware of a few instances where that happened. So yeah, if there's local people there that want to nominate a candidate, maybe they want to run themselves, absolutely do that. But I think the imperative, this kind of imperative, you have to run a candidate in every single seat in order to be a real party. That's what I kind of take exception to.
Okay, great. There was some feedback that it would be useful if I could give more people an opportunity to respond. So I'm going to pitch the following question to Erin, and then if either Royce or Sarah want to also join in, then that would be great. So Fiona McMurran is wondering whether or not political parties in Canada have a strategy for involving youth at the local constituency level during elections. And so what kind of advice would you give to try to get youth involved in politics during elections?
Yeah, I do think that that's something that really has to be pushed at the local level. And so maybe I'll go back to King's Hands and Cody Blois. When he first ran in 2019, he was, I think, 28, so would be young for a candidate, and he did make a particular effort, I think, to bring younger people into the campaign, and organized a youth council when he was elected, and that was a kind of a big component of what he was doing at the local level, was trying to bring younger people in. And I think that is something that all local district associations can look to. And it's something that in my own classrooms, I ask, students, if you want to get involved in party politics and make a difference, you could take over a local electoral district association, because a lot of them, as Royce was saying, just exist on paper, and that could be yours, and you could make it what you want it to be. Nobody's taken me up on that offer yet, but I think the candidates, I think the local district associations can find space for young people if the pitch is, and it matters, right? And we're going to see what you say translated in a way that will feel meaningful and impactful to you. Because I think there is that interest there, but you have to make the pitch, and it has to be genuine.
Okay. Sarah, Royce, did you want to add to that? Okay. I'm just going to throw in my own comment then, and that is that something that I often think about is I remember interviewing a pretty senior Canadian politician, and I've heard this said in other places that, you know, years ago, people used to be really, really proud to be part of a political party. This was something that, you know, they might have something on their displayed on their wall in their living room to show off to people. It was something that when there was an obituary, it would say this person was a long-standing member of this political party. We seem to have entered a world where saying that you're associated with a political party is not necessarily always a good thing, that the word party has become a bit of a pejorative, and the parties themselves recognize this. There's a reason why it's not known as you know, Trudeau's party so much as Team Trudeau. The word team seems to have replaced party. And I think that also for a lot of young people, there's something exciting about being an activist as opposed to necessarily being a party member. So I think for me, a lot of it is recognizing that if you're going to try to engage youth, that, you know, you have to harness the fact that activism is actually a great way to try to achieve your objectives is through political parties. And so there's a little bit of an education function that goes on there. But I think understanding that in some ways political parties are starting from a negative point in today's society is something, once you can recognize that, you can build on it perhaps a little bit. So Jim Shepherd wanted to get back to the question about paper candidates and was just wondering if anybody has any thoughts about the legacy of this orange wave of NDP candidates who unexpectedly won in 2011 in the Canadian federal election. And all of a sudden they were shocked, and some of them hadn't even visited the riding where they were, and suddenly they get elected. And so what was the legacy of those MPs? Did it, you know, how much of a difference did it make that they were people who are not necessarily even from the riding or didn't have very much experience there, and yet nevertheless ended up representing constituents in Parliament?
I can say so. I mean, a lot of those MPs aren't around anymore, but some of them went on to have really interesting careers, really prominent NDP MPs, and there's still some of them that are around. They've built up a local organization that has allowed them to, and a local name recognition, local profile that's allowed them to be reelected. And so these kinds of beachheads, these regional beachheads in Canadian politics are really important. If you're going to break into different areas as a party, you need those MPs there to kind of bring understanding to the party as a whole. And I think that contingent has been important for the NDP. Yeah, I'm not sure what else I would say in response to that.
I would just add that one of the things that I took away from the Orange Wave in Quebec was that it challenged, I think, a lot of popular assumptions about what a good politician should look like. And one of the big headlines was, you know, there's this MP who took a trip to Vegas and she still got elected. And then Ruth Ellen Brosseau turns out to be one of the most effective members of Parliament for that caucus. And I think those opportunities that sometimes you only see candidates get because they're in the unwinnable ridings are in these kind of extraordinary election outcomes, that it shows us that there's capacity, there's potential there for wonderful elected representatives who we just need to give the opportunity to, and we need to place them in the winnable ridings, because the Orange Wave was a once in a however many decades phenomena, and we need to make that a more regular occurrence. We need to look into those winnable ridings, and we need to get those candidates that can bring something different, I think.
Okay, great. So the next question is from Shannon McEwen, and we have about 15 minutes left, and time is going great, I think. So Shannon McEwen is wondering, is there any quantitative research on the effect of local campaigning on electoral results? So for example, what are the effects on the vote outcome if a candidate visits more doors, spends more money, or is simply just more famous? To what extent are they going to potentially outperform the regional vote swing? So I have some thoughts on that, but I'll just see if others do. Okay, well, I'll just throw in before Erin says anything that there is actually quite a bit of research that says that I think the convention for a lot of us in Canada would say that it's up to 10% of what a local candidate is likely to have some sort of impact on. I've seen different research that says that, you know, maybe it's a little bit higher in Quebec, it's higher in rural areas, but of course what this tells us is it's actually quite low in urban areas. And that kind of makes sense, right? Because when you're in a rural area, you know people locally, they haven't moved around as much. You might know people from high school, whereas you're in an urban area, it's even hard to identify people because there might be tourists in the area and this kind of thing. So overall, a lot of us use kind of this rule between 5 and 10%, but I've seen research that says as little as 0, and I've seen research that says potentially as high as 20, although I think some people would find that a bit dubious. Erin, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to add, there's been, as you said, there's been lots of research. One project that stood out to me was by Will Cross, who's at Carleton University and has done lots of research on local campaigning. And he was looking at the 2015 election and what was going on in local ridings. And one of the things he found with the Liberal Party was that local riding associations that were really active during that campaign and had fundraising numbers that went up in comparison to the previous election, those ridings did better and the Liberals were more likely to win, which would also suggest that, you know, the activities that are going on at the local level do make a difference. And this was, you know, 2015 when the Liberals really were able to break through, but they were able to break through, especially in those ridings where the local campaign was doing a lot of work. And again, so this would really emphasize that what's going on the ground can matter, and it can make, I think, a significant difference.
Yeah, and it might matter even more in smaller places and also in provincial elections compared to federal. Sarah, in your experience, do you have any sense of how many people are voting for you versus the party or the leader or things that are beyond your control?
I think that's an excellent question. I think in my experience, so when I got elected the first time, our provincial government had gone from 31 Liberal seats down to 20, and I was one of 2 new Liberal MHAs elected that year. So I like to think I played a part in that, but you know, it could have been, it could be delusional. It could be, you know, 5% or something. But I guess here, I would have thought it's much higher than 20%, but obviously the research, that's just from my own perspective.
Okay.
Alex, can I add to that? In addition to what you said, like even if their difference is kind of marginal, like say it's 5%, there's lots of races in Canadian elections now that are decided by less than 5%. And so to the extent that the number of volunteers, the amount of money that local campaigns do increase the vote, and we know that they do, that could be making a big difference across the country.
I'll add to that if you don't mind. I think an important piece though is whether they're an incumbent or a new candidate. I would be interested in looking at, I might do some research after this to see if the numbers are different, because I think as a returning candidate, you know, you've kind of tested yourself and people have tested you, you've actually helped people or not, and you've met people's expectations or not. And so I would guess the impact of the party may be different depending on your performance as an elected member.
So there is research that says there is an incumbency advantage, but it's small, but other times it can be a disadvantage. If you think of the 1993 Canadian election as a perfect example, where there was just all sorts of frustration. And if you happen to be a PC or NDP candidate, it doesn't matter how strong you were locally, there was this big wave going against you. And so it actually brought you down because of your party affiliation. So we also have a question from Jim Carradine, who says, when I get the mantra from the candidate, quote, I just do what I'm told by the campaign manager who is adamant about follow the plan. And I find that I believe the advice is wrong based on what I see on the ground. How do I handle the interaction? So how do you deal with the fact that you might have a candidate who's not always able to see eye to eye with other suggestions?
I would just say you have to do, as a candidate, you just have to do what you think is right. You know, the campaign manager is not elected. The campaign manager doesn't, you know, isn't going to show up when people are having a crisis, you know, on a Sunday afternoon. So, you know, I take advice, but ultimately, I think as a candidate, they have to just ultimately make the best decision, and you just have to accept the consequences either for the constituent or the electors or then your party.
Right, and ultimately, am I right that the candidate is the one who's choosing the campaign manager to some extent, right? So isn't there sort of a bit of an unofficial hierarchy? Like who is really who is in charge? Is it the campaign manager or is it the candidate?
I personally would think the candidate's in charge. I know in some instances, you know, an expert campaign manager might be brought in to support like a new or a candidate who needs extra support. And I guess I can only speak for my own situation, but I would say the candidate always has to make, you know, the best decision that you can for the people. And, you know, they're electing you in your ability to make decisions on their behalf, right? So I guess you also have to have confidence in your ability to make the right decision. And, you know, yes, you support your party, but you can't always make decisions that your party wishes you to.
Yeah, Alec, most of the time the candidate would be choosing the campaign manager, but there are examples of for the EDA or the committee that they form, they'll actually select the campaign manager, usually with the input of the candidate. Yeah, I would be very surprised if there were places where the candidate and the campaign manager were disagreeing and then the campaign manager won out. I mean, clearly the candidate is the one that has the final say. I think the thing that I was trying to emphasize, certainly from what I found, is that the idea of having a campaign manager is a very important resource for a candidate that you can rely on to get advice, to get guidance that's not always clear necessarily to the candidate. In every election, there's an awful lot of first-time candidates that run that may not have a whole lot of experience in campaigns. And if they have an experienced party person, an experienced campaign manager, that can be an enormously a positive resource for them.
Great, thanks. We have about 6 or 7 minutes left. There's still some questions I'm going to get to. Just a quick comment that I'm really happy to see so many questions. If there are any women in the audience who would like to bring forward some questions, I'd love to hear from you because it just happens that a number are from men. So if any women want to ask some questions, we'll make sure to hear from you as well. So there's a question from Peter Van Vloten. Any thoughts about volunteer recruitment from both the perspective of the Electoral District Association and the candidate? What are some challenges and proven approaches about volunteer recruitment?
Maybe I can start because I did speak about that with Cody Blois, and he had this experience in 2019 of just being the candidate. He hadn't been elected as an MP yet, so all of his focus was on campaigning. And you know, I think he tried to hit every house in the riding, and it's a rural riding, so it's a pretty big riding. And realizing in 2021, in addition to the fact that, you know, it's a pandemic, and so people are more weary in terms of volunteering, they're just tired, that he also had these duties as a member of parliament. And so the balance was just way off in a way that he realized that you just can't do everything yourself as the candidate. And so one of the lessons for him was looking forward into future elections, I need to build a team and for these election campaigns, but it was about relationship building long term, like starting now and getting leaders in different parts of the riding that will be able to help him for the next election campaign, whenever that might be. But that really does seem like something to speak to an incumbent advantage, that a member of parliament can plan to build relations over time in anticipation of the next election, whereas a party candidate who is just the candidate, you know, coming into an election probably doesn't have that opportunity. But that was certainly one of the take-home lessons for Blois in this 2021 election, was the team needs to be deeper if it's going to be sustainable, because he was tired at the end of it. He won, but he was very tired.
I'll just add, I guess, from my perspective, so I bring my volunteers, my friends and my family that I've begged, borrowed and stolen to come and help. But then I guess from my experience, there's also the party volunteers who are, you know, in the city of St. John's, and they would go to different candidates. And sometimes it comes down to who has the better snacks or who has, you know, the coolest people at volunteering. And, you know, it's up to the volunteers to go where they want. So, you know, we're always trying to recruit them to come to our team, but also I guess the shared understanding of who needs those volunteers the most. That's also an important consideration.
Okay, we have one last question, but we only have time for a succinct answer. And so the question is from Julie Davis. how does digital marketing play into campaigning on the local level? So what happens with digital campaigning on the local level? So just a succinct answer would be great.
I can get it, but I'm happy for Royce. I just spoke.
I don't have anything insightful to say. They're using it more and more, especially Facebook ads. Yeah, I'm not sure it makes a huge difference. But Sarah, maybe you probably have something better than that.
Well, the thing that I would add is one thing I found very effective is local Facebook groups. So in my area, there's 3 distinct physical locations, and like a community, like a suburb, for example, and they have a Facebook group, and that's quite active during the year. And so what I found personally is most effective, rather than pushing on my channels, I, as a candidate, will post on those, in those forums about issues that only matter to that specific group of individuals. And I found that just a good use of my time, rather than posting on my, Sarah Stoodley page, I post on the this group of housing, this community's page, things that I think they care about during the election.
All right, so that's the time that we have today. So I just want to thank Erin Crandall, Royce Koop, and Sarah Stoodley for your time and your insights. I want to thank IRPP for organizing this. I want to thank UBC Press for agreeing to have some of the chapter material that both Royce and Erin had prepared to be published by Policy Options, and the book will be coming out in June. And finally, I want to thank everybody who logged in. It's very much appreciated that you would want to engage and learn more about local level campaigning, which obviously we all think is quite important.